I remember the night so vividly, like it was etched into my chest. Valentine's dinner, the one evening of the year that was supposed to be about us, was supposed to be ours. But as soon as I walked into the dimly lit restaurant, I realized it wasn't. Charles had already invited her, Lila, his work wife, to join. She's lonely. Don't be weird, Charles said with a shrug when I hesitated, as if my hesitation was unreasonable. And the rest of the night? He laughed and shared stories with her, not politely, not casually, laughing at her jokes the way he never laughed at mine. I sat there with my steak growing cold, trying to be present, trying to find a corner of my own relationship in the table that was supposed to belong to us. But I didn't exist in their world that night. I remember standing up, my hand trembling, dropping the cash on the table. "Looks like you've already chosen," I said. Their faces froze, shock and guilt flashing in Lila's eyes, a flicker of surprise on Charles's. But it didn't matter anymore. I walked out, my pulse hammering in my ears, and the cold air of the Seattle streets hit me like a slap. Sometimes you don't realize how invisible you've become in your own life until someone forces you to see it in real time. That night was my revelation. That night was my breaking point. I didn't just lose Charles's attention. I realized I had been living in a relationship where my presence could be overlooked, my needs deferred, and my worth silently questioned. And in that moment, standing on the sidewalk with the neon glow of the city reflecting in my teary eyes, I made a decision. I would no longer be invisible. I would no longer tolerate being second to anyone, no one, not even someone I loved. That night, Valentine's Day, became the catalyst for reclaiming myself. I met Charles 3 years ago at a friend's birthday party. He was immediately magnetic. Warm smile, quick wit, and the kind of humor that made everyone in the room feel at ease. I remember thinking, he looks at people like they matter. By the end of the night, we had exchanged numbers, and I left with a fluttering heart, already imagining the life of laughter and shared secrets that might come. Our early days were effortless. Coffee runs that turned into hours-long conversations, weekend hikes that ended with pizza on the couch, the kind of intimacy that builds slowly but unshakably. Charles had two qualities I adored. He was attentive when it mattered, and he made me feel like I had someone in my corner in a world that often felt indifferent. We talked about moving in together, about future plans, about travel and tiny adventures. Everything felt safe, secure, and promising. Then there was Lila. She joined Charles's team at work a little over a year ago. From the start, I sensed her charisma, bright laugh, expressive gestures, and a magnetic energy that made Charles's eyes light up whenever they were together. I told myself to relax. Workplace friendships were normal. But it wasn't long before I noticed how often Lila appeared in his conversations. She wasn't just a coworker, she was woven into his emotional world in ways that left me uneasy. Lunch breaks, after-work hangouts, inside jokes, shared memes at midnight, they had a rhythm I wasn't part of, and yet, I rationalized it. Charles had always been honest with me. He had nothing to hide. So I excused the small pangs of jealousy that rose whenever I heard about Lila helping with a project, or Charles laughing at a text from her. I told myself I was overthinking it. Friendship doesn't hurt anyone. For a while, everything seemed fine. Charles and I continued our routines, our conversations, our quiet evenings, but subtle shifts began to accumulate. He would reference Lila's advice when I suggested a restaurant. He laughed more at her jokes than mine. And though he never crossed a physical boundary, the emotional space he reserved for Lila felt vast, leaving me shrinking into the corners of my own relationship. I remember a rainy Saturday when we all went to a charity event together. Charles was animated, attentive, and charming, but it wasn't toward me. It was toward Lila. I watched, trying to smile, feeling a quiet sinking in my chest, a sense that my place in his life was negotiable, dependent on Lila's presence. That day, the first seeds of doubt were planted, small and almost imperceptible, but they grew steadily in the fertile soil of my growing awareness. And yet, I loved him. I loved Charles with every fiber of my being, and I clung to the memories of early joy, of shared laughter, of quiet nights that had once made me feel cherished. I wanted to believe we could navigate this, that our bond was strong enough to withstand external influences. I wanted to trust him fully. But the unease, the quiet, gnawing feeling that I was slowly being edged out, was impossible to ignore. By the time Valentine's Day arrived, the backstory of us, our shared moments, the laughter, the intimacy, the hope, was already shadowed by the tension between him and Lila. I hadn't realized it then, but that night would crystallize everything. It would reveal the truth of where I truly stood in Charles's divided attention, and force me to confront not just him, but the quiet erosion of my own sense of worth. It started subtly at first. Little things that seemed harmless, almost laughable, but they gnawed at the edges of my mind. Charles would mention Lila casually. Lila said this funny thing at work today. Or, Lila recommended that movie. At first, I smiled politely, nodding, convincing myself it was normal, just a colleague. But the mentions became more frequent, more intimate in tone. The way he described her laugh, the way his eyes lit up when recounting moments they shared, it was different from how he used to look at me. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was overreacting. Friends advised me not to be jealous, that close friendships at work are natural. And yet, a small voice in my chest whispered warnings I couldn't quite silence. You're being edged out. Then came the screenshots. She would send Charles little jokes, memes, and messages at odd hours. They weren't inappropriate, but they carried a warmth and familiarity that I hadn't seen directed toward me in months. Charles would laugh at them, responding with the kind of attentiveness and inside knowledge that made me feel like an outsider in my own relationship. I noticed changes in how he treated me. His attention shifted, the little gestures that had once made me feel safe, holding my hand, playful touches, whispering jokes, diminished. Instead, he carried a quiet eagerness, almost anticipatory, whenever he spoke about Lila. Even when I was present, it felt like my space was being quietly invaded, my emotions overlooked. I tried talking to him gently. I feel left out sometimes, I confessed one night, heart pounding, hands twisting in my lap. He reassured me, promised it wasn't intentional, but the warmth in his voice often returned to Lila the next morning in a string of cheerful texts. Each promise felt like smoke, tangible for a moment, but impossible to hold on to. One afternoon, I accompanied him to a small office gathering. He was lively, charming, but his energy centered on Lila. They laughed at private jokes, exchanged glances I couldn't interpret, shared subtle touches, a hand on a shoulder, a conspiratorial nudge. I tried to join in, attempted conversation, but I could feel the divide. I was a spectator, not a participant, watching someone I loved invest emotional intimacy elsewhere. The tipping point in this phase came when he casually suggested, "Hey, would you mind if Lila joined us for Valentine's dinner? She's been having a rough time and I don't want her to be alone." I froze, processing the suggestion. She's coming to our dinner? On Valentine's? His words were casual, but the weight behind them was heavy. My heart raced, a tight knot forming in my stomach. Charles's tone was calm, almost rational, yet it carried the subtle implication that my discomfort was unreasonable. I felt the first real pangs of betrayal, even before the night arrived. The conflict seed had sprouted, tiny but potent. My awareness of Charles's divided attention, of Lila's emotional infiltration, was no longer subtle. It demanded recognition. I realized that my feelings were valid, that my discomfort wasn't possessiveness, but a response to being overlooked, to being edged aside in my own relationship. That seed would grow, nurtured by the events of Valentine's Day, into a full-blown reckoning, one that would test not only Charles's loyalty, but the depth of my self-respect. Valentine's Day arrived with a chill in the Seattle air, but I barely noticed the cold. I was preoccupied, nerves jangling, heart pounding with anticipation and dread. I had made reservations weeks in advance at our favorite downtown restaurant, a place that had witnessed countless dates, countless quiet confessions. I had envisioned laughter and closeness, a night just for Charles and me. Then I saw her. Lila was already there when we arrived. Tall, radiant, and impossibly poised, she greeted Charles with a hug that lingered just long enough to make my stomach twist. Charles's face lit up the moment he saw her, his eyes shining in a way I hadn't seen for months when looking at me. I swallowed the sharp sting of jealousy, telling myself to be polite, to play the gracious partner. At first, I tried to focus on Charles, to reclaim the space that should have been ours. I asked about his week, laughed at his jokes, and even tried to engage Lila in light conversation. But it was futile. The two of them shared a language of glances, inside jokes, and subtle touches that I couldn't break into. Every time I tried, the thread of their connection pulled tighter, reminding me of my exclusion. Lila's laugh rang across the table, vibrant and intoxicating, and Charles leaned in, caught in it, fully present in a way that excluded me. My hands trembled, gripping the edge of the table. My steak sat untouched as I watched, feeling my own presence fade, my importance evaporating in real time. The final blow came when Lila made a teasing remark about how lucky she was to have Charles keeping her sane at work. And Charles, my Charles, placed his hand lightly on hers, responding, "You know I've always got your back." I froze, heart hammering, throat tight. The room blurred, the background noise receding, until there was only that hand, that laugh, that undeniable intimacy. Every memory of shared dinners, whispered jokes, and quiet support was suddenly eclipsed by the realization that he had been giving the kind of attention and emotional energy to someone else that I had been craving for months. I drew in a shaky breath and, without thinking, reached for my wallet. I laid down enough cash to cover my steak, my movements precise, deliberate. "You two look great together," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Charles blinked, confusion crossing his features. Lila's eyes widened, shock mingling with something else, guilt, maybe, or disbelief. "I'm breaking up with you, Charles," I continued, each word slicing through the tension like a scalpel. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating, lasting 10 seconds that felt like an eternity. Both Charles and Lila stared at me as though I had lost my mind. But I wasn't lost. I was found in my refusal to be invisible any longer. I stood up, straightened my shoulders, and turned toward the door. Their voices called after me, fragments of protest and confusion, but I didn't look back. Each step toward the cold Seattle night was a step toward reclaiming my life, my dignity, my self-respect. Outside, the air hit my face, sharp and cleansing. The neon lights of the city reflected in my teary eyes, but I didn't flinch. For the first time in months, I felt in control, not over Charles, not over Lila, but over myself. I had drawn the line, and I would not step back. That night was not just a breakup. It was a declaration. I would no longer accept crumbs of attention, love that was divided, or emotional intimacy that excluded me. The inciting incident was complete. The story of invisibility had ended, and the story of my empowerment was just beginning. The moment I stepped out into the cold Seattle night, the adrenaline that had carried me through the restaurant dissolved into a hollow ache. My hands were still trembling, my chest tight, and yet somewhere beneath the shock, a seed of clarity had taken root. I was no longer invisible. I had spoken. I had acted, and yet the weight of what I had done pressed heavily on me. My mind replayed every interaction, the laughter, the touches, the inside jokes I had never been a part of. I saw Charles leaning toward Lila, completely absorbed, and my stomach churned with a bitter cocktail of hurt and disbelief. The betrayal wasn't physical, it was emotional, and it cut deeper than anything I could have anticipated. I had loved him fully, trusted him with my heart, and yet he had allowed someone else to occupy the space I thought was sacred. As I walked, I felt the city lights blur through my tears. My phone buzzed relentlessly, and I resisted the urge to check it. I didn't want the apologies, the justifications, the manipulations. I didn't want to hear Charles say, "It's not what it looks like," or Lila plead for understanding. No explanation could undo what I had felt, the unmistakable clarity of being unseen in the person's life I had chosen to invest in the most. That night, I allowed myself to feel everything. Anger surged like a wildfire, scorching the edges of my rational mind. Sadness rolled in waves, each one threatening to pull me under. And beneath it all, a quiet, resolute clarity. I deserved better. I deserved someone whose first instinct was to make me feel valued, whose eyes sought me first, whose heart reserved its warmth for me, not as an afterthought. I returned home, wrapped myself in a blanket, and let the tears flow freely. I whispered the words to no one. I am enough. I am enough. I am enough. It was a mantra, a lifeline. For too long, I had justified the crumbs of attention, the fragmented emotional investment, convincing myself that love required tolerance of invisibility. But now I knew. Love without acknowledgement is not love. It is survival in someone else's emotional economy. The next days were a mix of chaos and clarity. Charles called, Lila sent messages, both insisting that it wasn't what it seemed, that I had overreacted. I read each message with a detached curiosity, noting the undertones of defensiveness, manipulation, and entitlement. My heart tightened, but I felt no compulsion to respond. For the first time, I realized that the power had shifted. I didn't need their validation. I had my own. Friends reached out, concerned and sympathetic, and I allowed myself to lean on them. Conversations were raw and unfiltered. I spoke aloud the truths I had buried, the ache of being second, the frustration of invisibility, the disillusionment with someone I had trusted completely. Speaking them aloud transformed them from a personal torment into a shared understanding, a lens through which I could see my own resilience. Sleep was elusive. Night after night, I replayed the evening, not obsessively, but analytically. I examined my feelings, traced the patterns, and acknowledged the warning signs I had ignored. The recognition was painful but empowering. I realized that heartbreak is not merely about loss. It is a teacher, forcing awareness of boundaries, self-worth, and emotional truth. By the end of the week, I was not healed, not yet, but I was grounded. The whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and grief had settled into a steady resolve. I was ready to face the consequences, to reclaim my life fully, and to ensure that never again would my heart be treated as an option, a placeholder, or an invisible presence. I understood that the night of Valentine's Day was a fracture in our shared story, but also a doorway into self-respect, clarity, and the beginning of reclaiming my emotional sovereignty. I had survived being invisible, and that survival was the first step toward a life where I would always be seen. The days after Valentine's Day were a relentless storm. Charles didn't accept my silence. Calls, texts, and even emails flooded in. Pleas, justifications, manipulations. Madeline, you overreacted, he wrote. I didn't mean to make you feel excluded. And then, in the next message, Lila is just a friend. You know that. But the repetition of just a friend did nothing to soothe the ache in my chest. It only underscored how their emotional intimacy had eclipsed me. Lila reached out too, polite, apologetic, seemingly unaware of the tension she had helped create. I read her messages with a detached awareness, each line a reminder that someone else had been the recipient of attention I had craved. Her laughter at Charles's jokes replayed in my mind like a haunting melody, making me question not my feelings, but the priorities of the man I had loved. Then came Charles's family. My silence didn't go unnoticed. His mother called, her tone sweet, but tinged with concern. Madeline, you need to understand Charles's intentions. He's not trying to hurt you. I smiled bitterly to myself. Intentions didn't erase the reality. Actions did, and Charles's actions had made me invisible. Friends were divided. Some urged reconciliation, citing Charles's charm, his history with me, his apparent remorse. Others, closer to me, whispered truths I already knew but hadn't dared articulate aloud. He allowed you to fade while someone else took your place. That is not acceptable. I clung to these voices, like flares cutting through the fog of confusion and betrayal. Work became another arena of tension. Charles continued his routine with Lila, their dynamic seemingly unchanged, oblivious, or willfully blind to the rupture he had caused. I felt eyes on me, whispered remarks, the subtle shifts in atmosphere that accompany someone who has recently drawn a line and refused to step back. Each encounter with Charles became a test of my composure. I learned to speak clearly, firmly, without bitterness, but always with the fire of indignation smoldering beneath the surface. One evening, Charles showed up at my apartment unannounced, holding flowers. I just want to talk, he said, earnest, eyes pleading. I let him in, curious and cautious. He spoke at length, laying out his version of events. Lila was lonely. He meant no harm. He had been overwhelmed. I had misunderstood. I listened, nodding silently, feeling the old tug of affection mixed with raw fury. I just don't want to lose you, he said, voice low. And in that moment, I realized that desire alone is not enough to restore trust. Desire cannot replace the security of being truly seen. My throat tightened, and I spoke with calm, cutting clarity. Charles, I loved you. I trusted you. But trust is not a guarantee of obedience. Love is not measured by presence in someone else's life. I will not step aside to validate your emotional choices. The conversation escalated, voices rising, emotions laid bare. Charles's frustration was palpable. Lila's absence felt like a ghost hovering over us. I refused to back down. Each word I spoke carved the boundary I had drawn, each pause a challenge to their assumptions that I would forgive without recognition. Family and friends became an echo chamber of advice, judgment, and reflection. Some urged me to forgive, to understand Charles's perspective. Others reinforced my resolve that being secondary in one's own relationship is unacceptable, that emotional fidelity is as critical as physical. These voices grounded me, but also heightened the drama, making every interaction, every text, every imagined glance between Charles and Lila feel like a new battleground. By the end of the week, I was exhausted, emotionally raw, yet resolute. The escalation was not just external, it was internal. I wrestled with anger, grief, disappointment, but also with a fierce, growing clarity about my self-worth. I realized that this storm, Charles's manipulation, Lila's obliviousness, family interference, was ultimately a test of my own boundaries. And I would not falter. The world around me had become chaotic, every text and call a reminder of the fracture in what I had believed was stable. But within me, a spark had ignited, fierce and unyielding. I was learning to honor my own needs, to protect my heart, and to refuse invisibility in any form. The escalation was complete, not just in the external chaos, but in the awakening of my own power, my capacity to demand respect, and my refusal to settle for anything less than clarity, attention, and recognition in love. By the middle of that second week after Valentine's, exhaustion had seeped into my bones. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach lurched, anticipating another message from Charles or Lila, another attempt to justify, manipulate, or cajole. I had expected anger, maybe sadness, but the raw, gnawing sense of invisibility cut deeper than anything I had imagined. I found myself alone in my apartment one rainy evening, the lights muted, the city outside blurred through wet glass. I sank onto the couch, pulling my knees to my chest, and let the full weight of reality crash over me. Charles, the man I had trusted, the one I had envisioned a future with, had chosen, time and again, to place someone else's company, laughter, and emotional intimacy above mine. I replayed the evening in excruciating detail. His hand on Lila's, the way he laughed at her jokes, the warmth in his gaze that had once been mine, now directed elsewhere. I imagined the whispered exchanges, the glances that carried secrets I wasn't allowed to know. The betrayal wasn't just in their presence, it was in the small, accumulated acts of attention that Charles had freely given to another woman while I shrank into the shadows of our shared life. Tears streamed down my face, unbidden, as I realized the depth of my own disorientation. My self-worth, my sense of being seen, had been tied to someone who had quietly reallocated his heart elsewhere. I felt adrift, unanchored, like a spectator watching my life unfold in someone else's script. The storm of anger, grief, and disbelief swirled inside me, leaving me numb yet raw, hollow yet consumed by the need for recognition. I called no one. I texted no one. I just sat, listening to the rain, feeling the cold seep into my skin, and letting the helplessness wash over me. Every dream I had built with Charles, every plan, every whispered hope, felt tainted. Love, I realized with a painful clarity, was not just about shared experiences. It was about presence, acknowledgement, and emotional reciprocity, and mine had been denied. Sleep offered no refuge. Night after night, I lay awake, replaying their interactions, their laughter, Charles's gaze for Lila, and the hand that had rested lightly on hers. My chest ached with the weight of exclusion, my mind spinning through questions with no answers. Why was I not enough? Was I overreacting? Did I misunderstand everything? Each thought spiraled, each memory sharpened the ache. The world outside moved on. Friends continued with their routines, unaware of the tempest that raged within me. Charles, I assumed, carried on as if nothing had happened, as if our relationship were just a hiccup to be smoothed over with explanations and apologies. And Lila? Oblivious, innocent, or conveniently unaware of the chaos her presence had wrought. In the deepest hours of that night, I understood the stark truth. I had been invisible. Not because I lacked love or devotion, but because someone I trusted had chosen to prioritize another's presence and attention over mine. And the realization hurt more than any argument, more than any confrontation ever could. It was not just the fracture of a relationship, it was the fracture of certainty, of trust, of the emotional sanctuary I had believed existed. Yet even in that darkness, a faint, stubborn ember glimmered. Somewhere beneath the grief and the anger, a quiet voice whispered, "You will not let this define you. You will not allow your worth to be determined by someone else's inability to see you." It was fragile, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And it was enough to hold on to, a lifeline leading toward clarity, toward reclaiming power, toward the moment when I would no longer be invisible. The revelation didn't come with fireworks or a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, in fragments, as truths I had sensed all along fell into place. Charles had not just been inattentive, he had actively created a narrative that justified the emotional space Lila occupied in his life. She had told Lila that we were on a break, or at least distant, giving him permission to step into the intimacy that was rightfully ours. I discovered this when a message inadvertently revealed the extent of the misrepresentation. My chest tightened as I read Lila's casual acknowledgement that Charles had confided in her about our distance, implying my discomfort was unreasonable, painting me as the problem. The pieces clicked. Every moment I had felt invisible, every pang of exclusion, was not simply negligence. It had been enabled by deliberate storytelling. The clarity hit me like a storm. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a choice. Charles had prioritized another's presence over mine, had allowed narratives to be twisted to suit emotional convenience, and had expected me to accept it silently. I felt fury, betrayal, and heartbreak converge into a single, electrifying determination. I confronted Charles, calm but unyielding. "I understand now," I said, voice steady but charged. "You told her we were distant. You framed me as unreasonable. You allowed someone else to take the space you should have reserved for me." His eyes widened, guilt flashing briefly before he tried to deflect, to soften the blow with excuses. But I wouldn't let them soften me. "No, Charles. This isn't about excuses. This is about accountability. I loved you fully, but you chose someone else's company over mine. You built a narrative to justify your choices and expected me to accept being invisible. That ends now." Each word carried the weight of the weeks of pain, anger, and sleepless nights. Each syllable reclaimed the space that had been denied me. Lila's role became clearer too. While her intentions may not have been malicious, her presence had facilitated the erasure of my importance. I understood her connection with Charles, the way they laughed and shared moments, but that clarity only strengthened my resolve. Their emotional intimacy had been allowed, nurtured, and prioritized by the person I had trusted most. In that confrontation, I felt a shift, subtle but profound. Charles's defenses fell away, replaced with the recognition that he could no longer manipulate the narrative or my feelings. I wasn't begging for understanding or reconciliation. I was asserting my autonomy, my right to be seen and valued. The power had shifted, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in awareness. I told him, "I am not invisible. I will not accept crumbs of attention, emotional or otherwise. You have made your choices clear, and now I am making mine. I deserve someone who sees me first, consistently, without having to compete for space in their heart." The words felt like a cleansing wind, sweeping away the remnants of doubt and pain, leaving behind the bedrock of self-respect. For the first time in weeks, I felt in control, not over Charles, not over Lila, but over myself. The heartbreak was still there, but it no longer held me captive. I had confronted the truth, faced the emotional betrayal, and declared my boundaries without compromise. The turning point was complete. I was no longer a passive participant in someone else's choices. I had reclaimed the authority over my own emotional landscape. The empowerment didn't erase the sadness, but it transformed it. Heartbreak became clarity, exclusion became discernment, and invisibility became a lesson in self-worth. I understood now that love is not passive, it is active, deliberate, and reciprocated, and I would no longer accept anything less. The days that followed were a whirlwind of consequence, both external and internal. Charles's attempts to contact me intensified at first. Calls, texts, voicemails that oscillated between pleading, apologetic, and accusatory. "Madeline, you're overreacting," he wrote. "I didn't realize how you felt." Each message felt like a desperate grasp at control, but I no longer responded. Silence became my weapon, my boundary, and my statement. Lila, too, seemed to waver in her demeanor. Casual messages that had once been lighthearted now carried an edge of awareness. She knew, without me having to spell it out, that the emotional intimacy she shared with Charles had consequences, not just for me, but for the delicate web of trust and respect that had been shattered. I felt no need to confront her further. Her role in this drama had been illuminated by my own clarity. Her presence no longer held power over my emotions. Charles's family became uneasy observers. His mother, once a soft voice of reason urging reconciliation, now confronted the reality that my decision was firm. Attempts to persuade or guilt me were met with polite, unwavering firmness. I had learned the art of saying no without apology, of asserting my autonomy while maintaining my dignity. The fallout from their concern was minimal. My own boundaries had become my shield. Work interactions, which had been fraught with tension, now felt different. Charles and Lila maintained their routines, but their glances, their shared stories, the energy that had once excluded me, no longer held sway over my attention or my self-worth. I engaged with colleagues, friends, and my own projects with renewed focus. The emotional space I had reclaimed allowed me to thrive in ways that had been impossible when my energy had been consumed by their invisibility. I began to rebuild my life deliberately. Weekends were no longer dictated by uncertainty or dread. I rejoined activities I had set aside: hiking, climbing, and small adventures that reminded me of my own strength. I cultivated friendships that reinforced my value, seeking out connections that celebrated, rather than overshadowed, my presence. Each choice was an assertion of autonomy, a declaration that my life was mine to shape, unbound by those who had failed to see me. Charles's attempts to manipulate the narrative slowly diminished. Without my attention, his pleas lost their effectiveness. I realized that power, in relationships, is not about who shouts the loudest or dominates the space, but about who maintains clarity, integrity, and self-respect. By refusing to react, I allowed the truth to stand unchallenged. My visibility, my worth, and my emotional sovereignty could not be dictated by anyone else. In private moments, I reflected on the intensity of the past weeks. The heartbreak, the betrayal, and the humiliation had been excruciating, but they had also forged a new resilience. I understood now that love is not simply about affection. It is about respect, reciprocity, and the unwavering acknowledgement of each person's presence. Charles had failed to provide that. Lila had been complicit, even unknowingly, and I, at last, had reclaimed the space that was rightfully mine. As the dust settled, I felt a profound sense of liberation. No longer tethered to the expectations, excuses, or manipulations of others, I could pursue connections that honored my worth. The fallout had reshaped the landscape of my life. Charles and Lila faced the consequences of their choices, while I stepped forward, clear-eyed, empowered, and entirely visible to myself. The lesson was undeniable. Invisibility is a violation of self-respect, and in refusing to tolerate it, I had reclaimed not just my dignity, but the very essence of who I was. The storm had passed, and I stood stronger, ready for a life where I would be seen, valued, and cherished. Not as a backup, not as an option, but as a priority. Weeks passed, and the ache that had once consumed me gradually softened. The nights I spent replaying Charles and Lila's laughter gave way to quiet evenings filled with my own choices, my own presence. I learned that healing is not a sudden flash of relief. It is a series of deliberate acts, a reconstruction of self from the fragments left by betrayal. I started to cherish the parts of life I had neglected: morning hikes, late-night conversations with friends, and simple moments where I could feel my heart steady, unshaken by the whims of others. Each step reminded me of my own worth, of the truth that had been obscured for far too long, that I deserve attention, respect, and love without negotiation. When Charles finally sent a message, I read it and set it aside, unread, not out of spite, but because closure does not require confrontation. I had already closed this chapter in my heart. No apology, no explanation could alter the clarity I had gained, the lessons I had internalized. And then, unexpectedly, life presented new connections, people whose presence felt genuine, whose attention was deliberate and consistent. Moments with them were untainted by games or manipulations. I realized that the gift of being seen is not something to demand from someone else. It is something to cultivate in spaces and with people who choose to honor your existence freely. The lesson crystallized. Invisibility is a violation of the soul. To be truly loved is to be seen, consistently and unapologetically. And to honor oneself is to walk away from anyone who diminishes that truth. I had survived heartbreak, exposure, and manipulation. I had reclaimed my power, and with it, the right to be the priority in my own life. Standing on my balcony one evening, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars, I felt a profound sense of peace. I was no longer tethered to those who could not see me. I was free, visible, and whole. The storm had passed, but the clarity remained. The right person will never make you compete for their attention. They will choose you, unmistakably, without hesitation, and I would never settle for less again.